Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm going to speak on Russian communication strategy, which is based on several projects that I'm involved in. I will give some details about this project in a moment. But before that, I want to speak a little bit about collage. Collage is frequently confused with puzzle. The idea of puzzle is that you understand the picture, you give the sense of the whole only once you assemble it. Collage, on the other hand, is a collection of bits and pieces of different material, of different art that make sense together, but also as pieces separately. I frequently hear from my colleagues who study Russian communications, Russian strategy, or they don't have strategy. Their strategy is to throw spaghetti to the wall to see what sticks and what doesn't stick. This is not true. And it comes from the idea that if you're looking for only one side of the collage and you suddenly compare it to the other side, it does not make sense. Because collage makes sense as a whole piece together. And I will try to explain how Russian strategy is a collage. We collected data on different projects from different sources. The project that I was involved with, it's funded by NATO Stratcom COE together with Debunk. We collected Russian official websites. How Russian officials' websites, all their ministries communicate on the websites. In terms of the target audience, mainly Russian domestic, but also international. This is the main source of the official communications of the Kremlin. In other sources, we went and collected Twitter and Telegram accounts of more than 130 Russian embassies around the world. This is Russian official communications, how Russians MFA communicates around the world. And then we also collected Russian language Telegram ecosystem, mainly war-related. Some of them have kind of Baltic target Baltic audiences, some of them Ukrainian audiences, and some of them Russian domestics. So let's start from the global picture, Russian official communications worldwide. As I said, we collected more than 129 countries over Twitter and Telegram. By the way, if anybody was following Russian Telegram communications, particularly MFA, presence on Telegram, you didn't have to be in deep intelligence rooms. Day before the invasion, all Russian embassies around the world created Telegram accounts. What do you think will be the country with most active embassy? Well, Kazakhstan is understandable. The second one is Japan. Then you think, okay. These are the top most active embassies around the world. If you can see here, generally it can be divided into sort of three groups. The first group, adversaries. So you have NATO members, Germany, United States, other members of NATO. The second one are kind of sort of friends, partners, if you like, obviously Kazakhstan, Iran. But then you have also countries of interest. For example, here you can see Senegal, Lebanon, Romania, which has a very good interest. We're all aware of that interest after the elections. So there is a certain logic behind it. There is a certain allocation of resources behind it. Now, Japan. Why is Japan? Why Japan is the most active embassy? So we decided to look at a few examples here. The first one was Japan. This is the weekly number of comments by a Russian embassy just before the beginning of the war until the end of 2024. We can clearly see there is a general division. They communicate differently on Telegram and on Twitter in different quantities and on different events. But this is not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is the language. So usually the embassy representation will communicate information in three different aspects. First of all, they will communicate to their own citizens in the country, celebrate the holidays, come to exchange visas, come to renew passports, that sort of communications, which will be usually done in the language of the embassy. The second sort of communication will be to present the opinion of the state on different events in the world. And the third one is to communicate to the local audiences, which will be done in local language. We can see a clear change in strategy, so we can target in audiences across the time. We can see in the beginning of the war, the communications were mainly divided into one-third, one-third, and one-third across three main languages. Currently, English completely disappeared. They communicate in Japanese and in Russian, 50-50. And when we showed their posting to our Japanese colleagues and representatives from the Japanese government, who usually believe, well, Japanese is a complicated language and you can clearly separate it. This is not ChatGPT generated messaging in Japanese. This is proper Japanese that a Japanese person cannot separate it and say this is kind of artificially created or not. If we're talking about, okay, so what they're talking about. So we decided to focus on Ukraine and NATO. How much of the content pushed by Russian embassy in Japan is not about Russian pilmeni or Russian ballet, but actually about topics that matter to Russia. This is in percentages. So you can see on average about 35% of Russian communications in Japan about Ukraine. And believe me, they are not saying that Ukraine is a great state to the Japanese audiences. Slightly less, about 15% on average, they're talking about NATO. And believe me, they're not saying that the NATO is a great alliance. So we decided to see, okay, so what they're actually saying. Well, when they're talking about Ukraine, what are the associated words that they use in talking about Ukraine? They're basically talking about, when they mention Ukraine, they mention about West. In Ukraine, it's about war with the West. The Western countries, with the Western people, etc. When they're talking about NATO, they're talking about the United States. And the difficult relationship, particularly around Okinawa and other areas in Japan, trying to undermine the relationship between Japan and United States. And this is in the highest percentage in Japanese to Japanese people. Now, another case that we decided to focus on is Argentina. Why Argentina? Well, because Argentina is far away, it seems to be out of the interest of anybody. Nobody cares what is happening in Argentina. So here we can see completely different strategy. First of all, we can see a perfect correlation between what Russians are saying and how much they're saying on their Twitter and Telegram. If you remember, in Japan, there were two different sort of communications. Here we can see a perfect alliance, and it's all in Spanish. It's not in English, not in Russian. In Argentina, they speak in Spanish. And what do they say? Well, they say about Ukraine and NATO. So here we have, again, about 35% of Russian embassy in Argentina communications are about Ukraine. Much less about NATO, because Argentina is far away from NATO. They don't feel this topic is important for their Argentinian audiences. When they speak about Ukraine, they speak about Western world, because war in Ukraine, in their communications, it's not a war in Ukraine. There is no war in Ukraine. There is a war against the West, and West is a colonial power, and remember what is happening with the West, and they do it in perfect Spanish in Argentina. When they speak about NATO, there is a high correlation between these two. So this is one part of the collage. Another interesting part of the collage is the Russian official websites. So we collected all this data and we said, okay, so how much are they talking about war in Ukraine? Well, sorry, it's a special military operation. They don't speak about war. If you look at how much they speak about war, zero. But how much they speak about Ukraine or about special military operation? Apparently, much less than they speak abroad. When we look at, for example, Ministry of Defense, the ministry responsible for the special military operation in Ukraine, their mentioning of special military operation in Ukraine is around like 17%. Plus, sometimes it's going a little bit higher. What are the rest of communications about? Oh, we built a new barracks. Oh, we conducted a nice exercise. We introduced a new piece of equipment. Things as usual. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the only ministry that actually speaks a little bit about Ukraine and the special military operation. The rest don't. It's like nothing happens. Well, on the one hand, we should remember that, well, I have never done this lecture in Ottawa. I usually do it across European capitals. And my punch point is that we should remember that here we are closer to the battlefield than people in Vladivostok. Probably does not apply to Ottawa. But for the majority of Russians who consume this sort of information, it's a distant battle, a distant conflict, and Kremlin wants to keep it this way. And they don't communicate about it. Russian Telegram ecosystem. So we collected these millions of tweets from more than 300 Telegram channels. I'm aware that during the day we will hear much deeper analysis of Twitter. But what we decided to do, we decided to separate all the comments that we collected on Twitter to 4 main dimensions and see what they're talking about. So we separated everything using these keywords to military, foreign, economic dimensions and the dimension of liberated, because they're speaking about, they are occupied, but they don't speak about occupied territories. They speak about liberated, so we put them in. This is what we're looking for. With all economic sanctions and perceived or real economic hurdles in Russia, the economic topic comes last. Most of the communications are about foreign relations. This is what the ecosystem, the Telegram ecosystem talks about. Then we have military, then we have liberated. The topic related to economic issues in Russia or in liberated territories or etc. is the lowest one. This is not something that communicated within the system. So what they're talking about the military, when they speak about the military dimension, about the operation. First of all, they're talking about Western hardware for and in Ukraine, which is an interesting topic. It comes particularly after 22 and increasing 23. They're very careful in staging what they're saying, how they're saying. They follow in the great details every Western destroyed tank. They love references to Western media. They love some obscure Western politician from somewhere, nowhere, who will come and say something that will correlate with what they're saying and will amplify it on their networks. Well, okay, I will not speak about newly elected American president. They have much more references to the Western media and Western politicians than to their own media and their own politicians. They speak about Russian air attacks. They speak about Russian air defense. They speak much less about Ukrainian attacks, regardless how successful they are. And then, interestingly, now they're talking a lot about Western support to Ukraine and how inefficient, fragmented, or unsuccessful it will be. This is on Telegram. We did the same in the Russian official communications, and the picture is completely different. On Russian official websites, they speak about completely different topics. There's a small correlation in the military. So yes, they speak about destruction of Ukrainian forces, but then they speak a lot about training and readiness in the central military district, in Russian military, in all their districts, international training, games, etc. This is what the official communications in the military dimension will look like. Now, if we're trying to compare the major narratives, so these are too many narratives to comprehend. So let's focus on the three main ones. If we're looking for the major narratives in the military dimension on Telegram, then what we can see is the Western hardware in Ukraine, reports from the front lines, and Western support to Ukraine. This is the main communications on Telegram. In official communications, it's all about training and destruction of Ukrainian forces. If we're trying to combine these with the global picture, which I presented earlier, which I forgot to mention, the pilot study was funded by the Polish MFA and published by the Community of Democracies, which I done together with my Canadian colleague, Jean-Christophe Boucher from University of Calgary. But when we combine them all together, it does look like a collage. There's several main points out of this that we need to remember. First of all, if you're looking for only one side of the picture, well, this is my collage. There is not much information here. It's basically I took all the slides and stick them together. There are several points that we need to understand from there. First of all, in academia, we tend very frequently to focus on one side of the point. And when we are faced with something else, it's just throwing spaghetti, which is, they're not throwing spaghetti. In every type of their communication, in every target audience, there is a careful consideration, allocation of resources, creation of narratives, dissimulation of narratives, etc. Secondly, to understand Russian communication, we need to approach it as a collage. We need to recreate this collage, which we in academia frequently struggling to do. There's plenty of research on Telegram only. There's plenty on media only. All of it done with different methodologies in different time frames. So you actually even cannot combine them together. We are missing the forest for the trees. And if we focus on the bushes and suddenly we see the tree, we say, no, they're throwing spaghetti. It can't be true, which is not the case. And I think I'm just on time. So thank you very much for listening.